Okay, well, my name is Dr. Simon Grove. I'm the manager of the Sustainability branch at Forestry, Tasmania. I'm going to talk today about sustaining sustainability. Before I really get underway in this talk, I'd like you to have a look at these images here, just to get you thinking about what it means to be doing sustainable land management. So take a look at those landscapes and have a think about which of those represents, if any of them, represent sustainability to you. Perhaps it's a matter of which one looks nice. Perhaps it's a matter of which one gives you that warm fuzzy feeling inside. Perhaps it's a matter of which one looks productive, which one looks as though it's contributing to the economy of Tasmania. Or maybe it's about which one's actually doing something for biodiversity, or at least not completely denuding biodiversity. Or maybe it's a bit of all of those things. Just have a think about that. Okay, in this presentation I want to introduce what I mean by sustainability, in particular sustainable forest management. I want to spend most of the talk looking at the management systems that we try and keep in place to ensure that we're doing sustainable forest management, or at least to guide us towards that end. And I'll look at a couple of aspects of sustainable forest management, things that we clearly do want to sustain. I'm going to look at sustaining the wood supply, and I'll look at sustaining nature. And you'll see from the wording there that I've distinguished between the concept of reserving nature versus sustaining nature. And I'll finish by looking at asking the question of the title of the talk: are we actually sustaining sustainability? Okay, again, to get you thinking a bit as I start this talk, here's a couple of quotes from Patrick Moore, who's recently brought out a book called Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout. He's one of the founders of Greenpeace, but he's gone on a bit of a journey himself, and this is what he had to say last year. He said, "The process of incorporating environmental values into our decision-making lies at the heart of sustainability. It's not about pitting the environment against the economy and society, as if we could have one without the others. It's about finding an appropriate balance among them." And the other thing he said was, "The transformational power of sustainability theory is that it turns a foot soldier fighting environmental wars into a diplomat looking for peaceful solutions. It steers one from a stance of confrontation, telling people what they should stop doing, to trying to find consensus about what we should do instead." Okay, so that's Patrick Moore's take on sustainability. Here's another take on it. And for most of us, it probably starts with the environment. That's really what we're trying to sustain, perhaps. That's what we think it should be about. And that could be the local environment, it could be the planet. It's what economists call natural capital. But bear in mind that it's society that's concerned about this. It's society that's doing or not doing the sustaining. So there's an overlap between the needs of the environment and the needs of society, and sustainability is somewhere in that overlap area. But that's not the end of the story, because there's also the economy, what motivates people to do things. We're not entirely driven by money, but it's an important part of how we live. So really, sustainability is at the nexus of each of those three domains: the environment domain, the society domain, and the economy domain. You can have any two of those domains without having sustainability necessarily, but sustainability is where you have all three intersecting. There's another way of looking at this, which is that we only have one planet, we only have one overall environment, and society as a domain is embedded within the environment. And in this model, then economy is a small part of what society does. So it's a sort of embedded series of domains. And then there's another way of looking at it, which is one I quite like, which is to think of sustainability as a three-legged stool. And what people trying to ensure that sustainability happens are trying to do really is to balance that stool, making sure that it doesn't wobble and fall over. So you've got to have the legs the right length, they've got to be screwed on firmly in the right positions, otherwise the stool will fall over. So one of the legs being the economy, one society, and one environment. And here's an example of not sustainability. If those three legs are out of balance, the whole thing falls over. So in this instance, someone's put a lot of emphasis on the economic aspects of sustainability, and they've neglected the environment and society, and the whole thing's fallen over. So that's clearly not sustainability. Okay, into sustainability in forestry and in Forestry Tasmania. To sum it up, really, it's about long-term thinking and long-term planning. And it's not just about years, but it's about generations. Generations of people, generations of trees. It's about having management systems in place that keep things on track. We can use technical terms like continuous improvement and adaptive management, but that's the concept. It's about having the systems in place. It's about keeping natural, social and economic systems, those three domains, keeping them resilient. It's a useful word here, resilience, through maintaining them within their bands of tolerance, another useful word that I'll come back to. It's about optimising multiple values, not maximising single values. So essentially, it's about balance. Now you'll see these dials coming up in quite a few of my slides that follow here. What they're really doing is meant to be a graphical way of indicating sustainability or unsustainability. So, imagine you're trying to understand your effects on the system, and if you're managing to keep the dial in that green band, then you're managing to keep it sustainable. If it's going off into the red band, then it's effectively saying that you're not managing to sustain it. And the first place I'm using it is in this first slide here. What I'm trying to do here is build a model for sustainable forest management. I'm not quite sure what this Sustainomatic gizmo is. I've called it a sustainability regulator, but just for the sake of this model, imagine that you're trying to do sustainable forest management and you're viewing it as getting the right balance between wood production and the environment. This is how many people see it. It's quite a simplistic way of looking at it, but imagine you've got a lever on the left there, which you can either push up, which gives you more environmental outcomes and less wood, or you can pull it down, which gives you more wood, but fewer environmental outcomes. And you're monitoring what you're doing on the right there with that dial, and you're trying to keep the arrow pointing towards optimally sustainable in the middle of that green band there. And if you move the lever up or down a bit, it's going to wobble one way or the other towards non-sustainability. Well, that's a very simple model, and if only sustainable forest management were that simple, then, well, a lot of us would be out of jobs for a start. This is a little bit more complex. As I've already said, sustainability isn't just that one domain, it's at least three domains of society, environment and economy. So instead of having just one dial to monitor, we're actually monitoring three dials and trying to keep them all in that green band. We've got a problem though if we've only got a lever that goes up or down in that one dimension, because now we need it to be a joystick that can move in multiple dimensions, and you're trying to find the optimum spot, which may vary over time, that keeps those arrows in all three of those dials within the green band. That's getting a bit closer to what sustainable forest management's like, but that itself is also very simplistic, because as we all know, any one of those domains, environment, social or economy, actually consists of masses and masses of individual elements, each of which could be represented by one of these dials. So in effect what we're trying to do is keep all of those dials within those green bands, the bands of tolerance of sustainability. That's obviously a much harder challenge, particularly if you've only got a joystick driving it, because you're going to be having to constantly jiggle that joystick and watch multiple dials all at the same time, trying to keep everything within the green band, and more than likely you won't be able to. So this model isn't quite right either. Perhaps a better model is the fact that it's not driven by a joystick and one person in control. It's actually driven by a system, call it a forest management system, which involves numerous people. I've illustrated this as though it's the console of a warship or something like that, with several people in control of different parts of the console, with different knobs to press, different wheels to turn, and they're doing that. They're watching the dials and they're watching each other at the same time, and through all that they're trying to keep those various dials in the green band. It's quite a challenge, and you can imagine that if someone looks only at one of their dials and says, oh, I just want to tweak that one a little bit, it could have chaotic effects in this complex system. It could have effects way beyond what you'd expect in one of those other dials, perhaps in one of the other domains. So keeping it all on track is a very complex process, and it's hardly surprising that it's a very wobbly journey, and probably a never-ending journey. Okay, so we call this the forest management system, and here's another representation of the forest management system in terms of an environmental management system model. Our forest management system is certified as an environmental management system under ISO 14001, and we maintain that certification annually. But let's just run through roughly what an EMS and what our forest management system entails. And we'll start at the policy setting, because that's really the setting that's outside the system, and that the policy for forest management is set largely by governments. State government, national government, and even international agreements like the Montreal Agreement. We codify that within Forestry Tasmania in terms of a 10-year plan, which we would call a sustainability charter, and that sets the high-level targets for things that we want to do year in, year out, to accord with the policy. That feeds into yearly planning cycles, of which we document internally as things we're going to do this year. And all of those, everything that we do has to accord with the regulation that comes from the external regulation that comes through the Forest Practices Code, amongst other things. That box at the bottom there says "Welcome to the Forest Management System." That's a rather inadequate representation of our computer systems that we have in place to try and ensure that the whole system works effectively. So behind that one page there are hundreds of documents, interlinked pages, systems that require following up once you start a process, systems that enable you to do your corrective action checking, and so on. And it's summarising it as a box is a great oversimplification. Just maintaining that computer system is more than the full-time job of one person at Forestry Tasmania. It's a major undertaking. If all goes well, then through the management that we do, which is audited annually, more than annually, then we maintain our certification under the Australian Forestry Standard. That's not the end of the matter, of course. We have to not only report but also review on how we've done and make changes accordingly. So we report what we've done through our annual stewardship reports. This goes to members of the public. It also goes to state government who assess Forestry Tasmania's performance. And of course that goes back towards policy again. It's worth saying at this point that systems make it possible, but people make it happen. It requires a huge amount of professional expertise to keep this sort of system going. One of my concerns is that in keeping with the title of the talk, Sustaining Sustainability, currently the industry is going through a downsizing. We've got to be very wary that we don't lose the key human resources that enable us to keep this sort of system going. The last thing we want to do is to find ourselves not doing sustainable forest management because we don't have the capacity to keep the management system itself going. That wouldn't be sustainable. Okay, let's have a look at this long-term planning document, the Sustainability Charter. I quite like the slogan that comes with it, which really defines our view of sustainable forestry. We call it environmental forestry for the next generation. The Charter objectives are broadly in line with those from the Montreal process, which are applied nationally and internationally. What we say we're going to do, while producing wood, of course, is sustaining biodiversity and habitat, sustaining jobs for current and future generations, sustaining carbon stores, clean air, water and healthy forests, safety, community access and heritage, including tourism, and sustaining science-based stewardship. So these are the things that we report on annually. And I'm particularly keen to see that one at the bottom there, the sustaining science-based stewardship. Being a scientist myself, I understand just how important it is to be able to back up what you do with good, hard and empirical evidence and the critical thinking that comes with the science-based approach to stewardship. Okay, I said we'd look at a couple of the aspects of sustainability, a couple of the main things that we want to sustain, and clearly sustaining the wood supply is a key one. The map there shows in green the state production forests of Tasmania. At 1.5 million hectares, they comprise 14% of Tasmania's land area. You'll see that some of those areas of green are a darker shade than others. Those are the formal reserves on state forest. But clearly there's more reservation, or there's more to it than that, because only half of the area of state forest is actually available for wood production. The rest is either in those reserves or is otherwise unavailable for various reasons. What this translates to is that on average 1% of state forest is harvested each year. And the level of productivity of these state forests is, on average, about 3.2 metres cubed of wood per hectare per year. And that's up there with the productive forests of Finland and Germany, for instance, but it's certainly not excessive. The nice thing to be able to report here is that the eucalypts on state forests are growing faster than they're being harvested. And the balance of growth stages on state forest is predicted to undergo little overall change in the coming century. So to some extent those are measures of sustainability as well. We aim to sustain the wood supply through sustaining the forests that supply the wood. And that's demonstrated in those two charts. The upper chart there, looking at the residual standing volume, how much volume of wood there is currently, or when this analysis was done actually in 2006. And you can see that in 2095, the model predicted that there would be actually a higher standing volume than there is at the moment. And if you look at the lower graph, that's showing the spread of growth stages in the state forests over time. And it's suggesting that there will be change over the next century, but really the change is one of, is pretty subtle. And that if you look at the amount of mature forest that's likely to be there a century hence compared to currently, it's only marginally less than is there currently. What does grow particularly is the proportion of the estate that's in young regrowth forest, in other words that which has been harvested and is growing back again. Okay, periodically we calculate, we model a 90-year view of the predicted sustainable yield of high quality eucalypt sawlogs from state forests, and that's what this chart here represents from a 2007 viewpoint. Now this isn't the back of the envelope sort of calculation. This is based on a huge amount of pretty intensive modelling work and number crunching, and the models themselves are based on a range of factors, including a vast network of inventory plots throughout the estate, which are monitored, either permanent or temporary inventory plots, but thousands of these plots make up the means by which we understand how rapidly trees grow in different sorts of settings. And from those rates of growth, we can predict future yields, from also knowing the current stand structure across the estate as well. So what this chart is demonstrating is that the means by which we could sustain a yield of 300,000 cubic metres of high quality eucalypt sawlog per year for the next century. That magic number, 300,000, is what we are required to produce by law. You can see that not all those lines are flat. In fact, at the moment and for the next couple of decades, there's a lot of change happening. That change is primarily because we're not starting with a forest that already has a long history of having already been brought into management. We're starting with primarily unmanaged forests which are gradually being brought into management. So at the moment, there's that fair chunk in the bottom left-hand corner of mature native forest, but that proportion diminishes over time. This is in the production part of the landscape, of course, not the reserved part. And eventually, about 40 years hence, most of these different sorts of forest type become a lot more even. They flatten out. And the reason for the change currently, in fact, the reason there's a large blob there that's plantation forestry that just starts coming online about now, is that the plantation estate was largely established as a result of the Regional Forest Agreement in the mid-90s. So the Regional Forest Agreement brought about major changes to state forests because it reallocated a lot of production forest to reserves. So what we thought was the means of producing a sustained yield of 300,000 up until that point suddenly changed. As a consequence of that, there was a program of intensifying forest management on what was left of the production forest estate, and that included converting native forest to plantation. Those plantations are now growing, and the idea is that they'll be coming online increasingly over the next couple of decades to take up the slack that's been left through increased reservation. And a word about arisings. That's just a term that foresters use for the rest of the wood products coming out of state forests. So we're required by law to produce high quality eucalypt sawlog, but obviously a lot more comes out besides, including pulpwood and veneers. And I put it in there because this view in 2007 was that we're primarily talking about saw logs here, and that's what the industry is about. But these things change, and just at the moment there's quite a lot of change in the industry, which is seeing the priorities change away from saw log and more towards veneer logs, peelers, things that can be peeled in a rotary veneer mill, and various other means of creating laminated veneer lumber that doesn't require you to be growing large saw logs. And these may have profound implications for what we think of as sustaining wood supply into the future. Okay, moving on. I said there's a distinction, I want to draw a distinction between reserving nature and sustaining nature. It's really about where you're doing it. Reserves are a wonderful means of looking after nature, and Tasmania has a wonderful reserve system, and it includes 47% of Tasmania's forests, which is really outstanding. If you compare that to Germany, where less than 2% of the forests are reserved, and to Finland, where 6% of the forests are reserved, you can see we're in a league of our own. Not all of those red areas on that map are forest, of course, but they do include 47% of Tasmania's forests. And if you just look at the reserves which are in the highest classes for conservation values internationally, according to IUCN, then we're also in a league of our own. So Tasmania, on the right-hand end of that bar chart there, up close to 25% of Tasmania's land area is in these high-class reserves. That's the highest of any of the jurisdictions in that chart. It's higher than Australia on average, and it's higher than any of the other countries. Old growth has particular interests for conservationists, and quite rightly so. It's great to be able to report that 4/5 of all the old growth in Tasmania is already reserved. That's a good 1 million hectares or so. But I do want to point out that reservation on its own doesn't necessarily ensure conservation. It's a nice idea to think that you can call something a reserve on a map, maybe even put a fence around it, and assume that it's going to stay that way forever. But that's just not how these eucalypt forests in particular work. They're dynamic systems, and they're driven by fires, wildfires. What that means is that what's old growth now may or may not be old growth in the future, or it may be young forest. It may turn into some other sort of forest, a rainforest. So it's nice to be able to report that our old growth is well reserved, but it's a bit of a strange concept when it's such a dynamic resource. Which brings me on to the other aspect, is that reserving isn't the only way to actually sustain nature, and we still have a production forest beyond the reserved part of the estate, and we still want to be doing the right thing for nature there. We obviously don't want to be doing reservation across all that entire estate unless it's really necessary. And my view is that it's not necessary, because through planning we can get good conservation outcomes even in production forestry if we have the space and the flexibility to do it. So this first slide here, not a very exciting slide, but what it shows is a series of coop files. So each of those hanging files represents the paperwork that's required by planners, that planners produce in their negotiations with harvesters, contractors and the Forest Practices Authority, etc., before a single tree is harvested in a particular coop, a coop being a harvesting unit. So you can see some of those coop files are pretty slim. They're coops which are straightforward to get approvals for harvesting. Others are massive, the ones on the right, top right there, a massive amount of paperwork, and each of these files doesn't actually guarantee that there will be a harvest. They just say that we've gone through the process, a demonstration of the complexity of the process that we go through. And that complexity is illustrated by the words on this slide. A scatter of words. A lot of them are about natural values, which is the theme that I'm talking about at the moment. What sort of things do we need to think about to sustain nature? But also it's worth noting that a lot of those words are not about nature per se, but they clearly impact on it. And again, it gets back to the essence of sustainability, it being at that nexus of the ecology, the ecosystem, social system and economic system. So there's a word in there like markets, and markets change over time, as I've mentioned, and they also influence where we choose to harvest and when, and what sort of forest type we're choosing to harvest in. And then, of course, there's all the social aspects, looking at cultural heritage and visual amenity and smoke management and so on, neighbours. These all enter into every single planning process that we operate in. Okay, well, at least we're lucky in that we have some pretty complex and comprehensive planning tools, including a GIS system with a lot of information that's useful for planning. I can only touch on it here. This aerial photo shows an area of about probably 8 or 10 square kilometres, including some harvested coops, but also some unharvested production forest that might be available for harvesting in the future. It's at this level that we use aerial photos like this to then try and classify the forest into photo-interpreted forest types, which basically define stand structure and where the wood is and that sort of thing. We also obviously make use of contours and other overlays to get a feeling for the land. And on the basis of that, we can establish boundaries of provisional coops. So these are provisional areas that may or may not become the basis for future harvesting units, or indeed, in this case, past harvesting units. On this map also I've put an eagle's nest, that orangey red dot, which would have been detected through aerial surveys such as the one that's shown in the image on the right. And the data would have come from the Tasmanian Natural Values Atlas, which is now the central repository for this sort of information. I put it in there because the next map demonstrates that we take things such as eagle nests pretty seriously. So every single eagle nest that we locate on state forest is given its own 10-hectare reserve, a minimum of 10 hectares. You can see in this case that it's actually part of a much larger reserve. So what this map shows is, at this coarse scale, the delineation of this area of production forest into that which is still potentially available for harvest and that which is off limits for harvest. And there are various reasons for that being off limits. It could be the eagle nest issue. In the top left you can see an area that's demarcated as being too steep to harvest. Another area that's rainforest, we don't harvest pure rainforest. Others which are purely inaccessible or comprising non-commercial species, and so why would you harvest them? And then there are the provisions of the Forest Practices Code, which require a network of wildlife habitat strips snaking through the landscape. You can see one of those in this coverage, and also require buffering of streams with riparian areas known as streamside reserves. Now if we look more closely at the planning for a particular coop, so we're operating at a finer scale here, and I just wanted to run you through the coop planning process and how that affects the area that is eventually available for harvest. In this particular case, the aerial surveys and so on had caused us to delineate a coop of 91.6 hectares in extent. But most of the rest of the work from here on in is about walking the coop, getting to understand the land, the terrain, and seeing what is actually feasible, practical, justifiable. And on walking this particular coop, it was clear that the northern part of the coop was too steep for harvest, and so the area available for harvest has already come down by about a third. At the other end of the coop, there was an area of marsh and button grass. It's unlikely to have harvestable trees. B, the hydrology is very sensitive. C, it's almost certainly a sensitive vegetation community in its own right, so we don't want to be going in there with machinery. We don't want to be harvesting in there. And then there are rainforest areas, which, as I said, we have a policy about not harvesting rainforest. So by the time you've done that and taken out the required streamside reserves, you're down to an area which in this case is not much more than half of the original coop area. And that's the area which would be submitted as a forest practice, part of a Forest Practices Plan application. So 50% is actually towards the upper limit of the what we call a discount on the original coop, but typically it's about a third of every provisional coop boundary. A third of the forest within every provisional coop boundary never ends up being harvested because of these various reasons. I don't want to give the impression that only the unharvested retained bits have any value for nature. That's not the case at all, because the harvested areas have have immediate value as young forest, because there are plenty of species which are happy and indeed prefer to live in young forest. And it's also worth remembering that that forest then regrows. That's the whole purpose of the regeneration activities that we carry out after harvest, is to make sure that the forest regenerates. And as it does so, more and more of the native species will move back in there, maybe from the areas that had been retained. And the other aspect is that for some species that operate at a larger scale, birds, particularly larger birds and mammals, they may perceive a recently harvested area as hostile, and therefore they might not want to occupy that part of the landscape. But as it grows back and it becomes forest again, they start perceiving the entire landscape as forest again, and it becomes quite habitable again. So I want to move on now to asking the question, are we sustaining sustainability? I hope that the previous part of the presentation has demonstrated that we do try very hard to ensure that we are doing sustainable forest management. And it's complex. No one's claiming it's easy, but we try hard. But we're not immune to external influences, and sometimes it seems that even however hard we try, it's not good enough, which is what one of these slides, these photos in this slide says. Currently there are proposals for vastly increased reservation of state forest, and concerns about the impacts of these on jobs and on the economy. Not many concerns about the effects of this on the environment, but I do wonder about that. Anyway, it's up to governments to sort these issues out, and at the moment they have signed an agreement, and so we're awaiting the outcome of that process. The question I want to ask in Are We Sustaining Sustainability is it helpful for sustainability, and particularly for environmental sustainability, to be polarising our landscapes? And by that I mean putting our reserves over there and having our intensive production over here, because that's one of the possible trade-offs, is that with increased reservation we'll have increasingly intensive production in the bits that aren't reserved. The question is that good for sustainability? Globally, there's a trend towards integrating production and conservation. In other words, moving away from this polarisation model, even moving away from reservation to some extent, towards integrating production and retention and conservation. Is that a more sustainable way forward? This picture here of a landscape in Tasmania that I call an integrating landscape demonstrates the sort of aspects that this approach could entail. So, smaller harvesting areas, native forests rather than plantation, retained bits of mature forest scattered through the landscape, that sort of thing. Trying to keep a more of a joined up, connected, functional landscape. So currently there are proposals for up to 572,000 hectares of additional reserves, and much of this, if it came to pass, would be on the 1/4 of state forest that's still currently available for harvest. In addition, the idea is that there will be a guaranteed wood supply, at least till 2027, for saw logs and peelers. There might possibly be tougher regulations from the Forest Practices Authority. That seems to be the trend at the moment. The point I want to make is that these targets are mutually incompatible. It's like having that three-legged stool starting to wobble and fall over. I don't call that particularly sustainable. What it means is that compromises and trade-offs are inevitable. Really, the bottom line is that the forest is not a magic pudding. A magic pudding that you could keep on taking more and more out of, and it would just keep regenerating. Forests and forestry face real-world constraints, and they can't sustain everyone's expectations all of the time. So if we want to sustain the whole concept of sustainability in forestry, then society may have to choose. It may have to choose less additional reservation. It may have to choose for our forests to produce less wood. But bear in mind that as a society we're not consuming less wood, so it's going to be coming from somewhere else. There are also contractual and legal implications in that as well. Or less regulation. None of those might be particularly palatable to anyone or everyone. But sustainability, as we've seen before, is about this balance of those three domains. And we've got to try. It's not easy to find the way to do that balance. I'll finish off with this slide that says, sustainability is a journey, not a destination. I really think in the context of sustainable forest management in Tasmania, that's just as well, because I think there's a bumpy road ahead. We may never get to a finished, fixed point in terms of this is how we're going to do forestry, because it's quite right, there should continue to be debate and continue to be change, and forestry should continue to be responsive. But it's certainly going to be a bumpy road ahead. Thank you.